Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riders from the inside out. And I am Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer, developer of training for optimal balance. And with me is Deb Romero, orthopedic massage therapist, Alexander technique instructor, and her business is called Optimal Posture. So today's topic is, let me wrote it down, the different ways we learn. So we'll pick up a little bit from the last podcast where we talked about different strategies of interrupting strategies to find balance when we find ourselves in our fight flight nervous system or sympathetic nervous system. And those were pausing, redirecting, and just going out and spending energy in a constructive way, or taking a walk, exercising, whatever, to just spend the energy. And the pausing part of it is something I was really, it's a functional part of Alexander technique.
Yes, it is. It kind of what separates us from other types of therapies or whatever you want to call them. That and the pausing to inhibit the habit are the two main things that it's really the only way we can make those changes, because it's what they call an idiomotor programming. So idio means idea, motor. So what we have is little maps in our head. If I said to you, stand up, you go to a little file box in your brain and go, oh, I know how to do that. And it's a psychophysical response. So we have to interrupt that to reprogram and reorganize. Well, maybe that movement is not efficient enough. Kind of like the same thing you're doing with horses.
Exactly. And so the pause, the traditional word used by Alexander, who started the technique in the, I think, early 1900s, he used the word inhibit, but that can have a negative connotation. But I think it's a very accurate word for what we're doing when we say pause, is when we're in fight and flight or having an instinctual survival response, we're not thinking, right? So
no, we're not consciously aware we're in that rescue mode.
Right, survival mode. And so that moment of pause or inhibiting, like just stopping the action-reaction game of fight and flight, can actually help us shift out of that sympathetic nervous system and start to come into what we talked about, the learning frame of mind, or just the sympathetic nervous system, where we have more choice. Choice becomes more available for our response. And on a physical level, like with the Alexander technique, what really struck me with it was simple things like how we sit or stand or move or grab my bottle of water or whatever we do, that neural pathway, especially as adults, is so strong, it becomes an unconscious competence, an unconscious movement. But maybe we've never paused to think, am I creating a small repetitive damage to my body the way I'm doing it? Is this the most comfortable way to do it? Is this the most efficient way to do it? So inhibiting the action is it's a strategy for changing habits of movement.
Yeah, so as Alexander teachers, we always say, if you learn to inhibit, or in the horse world, you could call it a half halt, because that's what it is, if that makes more sense to you, the right thing will come. So if we just inhibit that response movement and ask, could I do this differently? Something different will come.
Yeah. And it might not be the exact right thing, but maybe it's
exactly.
Yeah.
But that there's a great article called The Lost Sixth Sense by David Gerlich. It was written quite a while ago. And the world we live in now, we've kind of lost that kinesthetic awareness of where we are in time and space, especially the relationship of limbs to torso and how are we moving. So the inhibition helps to bring all of that to consciousness so that you can, look at it and say, well, is this my best way I could use myself?
Which is a choice.
It is definitely a choice.
Yes.
Yeah.
How we move is a choice.
Or whether we move. Even if somebody says, would you like to sit down or have a seat? We have a choice, except in court. I think courtrooms are the only place that if they say sit, you might want to sit.
Yeah. Or the doctor's office. Yeah.
Right. So we forget we have those options, or to actually tune into, am I uncomfortable?
And that's what the pause gives us.
Yeah, the pause gives us that time to bring it to our conscious thought and redirect.
Yeah, to try something new, or redirect to the new habit you're trying to develop.
Right.
Yeah. And so in talking about the different ways we all learn, which in a nutshell, we all know there are auditory modes of learning, there are visual ways to learn, and there are kinesthetic ways to learn. And we've talked about this before. A lot of people who gravitate towards riding horses are natural kinesthetic learners. In school, when we sit in a desk, it's almost, other than kindergarten where we play with blocks, most of school is auditory and visual.
And if you think about it, it's very linear.
Yes.
It's paper. It's, I remember when I was teaching anatomy, I would always try to say, this is a 3D creature we're working with here. It's not a linear, like in an anatomy book or whatever, that, it's a moving, breathing instrument.
Well, and even realizing about myself that I'm strongest as a kinesthetic learner. And that was something I learned about myself a while ago. So when I'm in a classroom situation, even though I never go back and reread them, I handwrite notes, because I
do the same thing.
that actually for me is a way of building the memory and the understanding as a kinesthetic learner. And typing, like using the keyboard, doesn't have the same neural connection. It's not as directly a kinesthetic experience as writing something by hand. And I'll have to find the research on it, but I know that there is research that shows the retention, or the amount we were able to learn, is drastically different when we take handwritten notes or write things out by hand versus just working on a keyboard.
I'd love to see that. Yeah, because that's how I learn. And sometimes people don't even know how they learn. I usually ask new students that, what's your best way that you learn? And some people really have to do some digging to say, well, what is the best way that I learn?
And that is so fascinating because, well, I'll bring it up now, because there's this great book I wanted to bring up. It's an older book. I want to say it was published. I'm trying to see, published in last publication, 85. But this book is titled Using Your Brain for a Change, a little bit tongue in cheek there. And it's by Richard Bandler. And it's one of the earliest books on neuro-linguistic programming. And one of the things, this has been such a helpful book not only for learning, but also for sort of shifting your emotional state when you feel overwhelmed, or all kinds of uses. And one of the things in reading the book that was so interesting was it's quite literal how we express our internal experience. So if you listen to the words you choose, you start to get a clue as to which type learner you are the strongest. I mean, we can all learn through all three modes, through kinesthetic, which is touch, feeling, in physical movement, or visual, which is observing, or audio. We all learn through all three modes, but we might be strongest in one mode versus the other. And part of the way we can tell, and I learned to tap into this as a teacher, is the words people use to describe an internal experience. So some people will say, I hear what you mean. And some people will say, I see what you mean. And somebody will say, I feel that. I feel for you. So those expressions, like if we tend to use those words that are related to an auditory experience, a visual experience, or a kinesthetic experience, that helps us figure out where our maybe most rapid absorption of new information is going to come, even though we can use all three. So as I started to realize I was a very strong kinesthetic learner, instead of feeling like I struggled in school because I had to really, everything was sort of mental and abstract. And like, I began to really understand chemistry when I took horticulture classes and we covered soils. I go, now chemistry makes sense to me because it was more tangible. Or physics got really important to me when I got my scuba certification. I was like, they're not kidding. Like, you have to understand, this atmospheric pressure thing and force changes and how that could create air bubbles in your lungs. And it's like, oh, this is important. And when I ride, sometimes it's picturing, sometimes it's what I hear, or taking that theory and putting it into the experience of what I'm trying to do with a horse under saddle, right? And that's where Newton's laws of motion suddenly made a whole lot more sense when you're riding a horse, because it became to me a physical activity. So I could understand physics better through the interaction of forces between a horse and a rider. It makes perfect sense. But when I was taking chemistry classes in high school and we weren't doing anything, just memorization and all that, the experiments helped a little, but all that memorization stuff was difficult for me. Or I listened to a ton of podcasts, but I'll have to replay them because I don't absorb as much auditorily as I do kinesthetically. I learn a lot and I love them, but I find myself replaying the ones I really like because I'll pick up something different every time.
Yeah, and I think we're all and I like that, reading a book over again or listening to a podcast, because we're always at a different place of understanding at that moment.
Absolutely.
That something that, being that I homeschooled both my kids, something that didn't make sense 6 months ago, all of a sudden, oh yeah, that makes complete sense now. So it's wherever we are in our process, what we're able to take in.
Yes. But I think when we listen to our own words, if we just go through the day without trying, but we pay a little bit of attention to when we're expressing something or having a conversation, do our words describe something auditory more often, or visual more often, or a physical experience more often? And that is, our five senses take in all this input. But how we learn, or our strongest part of the experience, like musicians probably use a lot of auditory related words, and they're auditory learners, right? Where, an artist or a photographer might be super strong visually, and that makes sense to them. Or us as writers, or you as a body worker, it's much more a kinesthetic skill, right? To feel that.
Yeah.
So what we gravitate towards and how we describe our experience can help us decipher which one is strongest for us. And we can all use all three, but like when I read a book, if I'm trying to picture what I'm reading, it's tediously slow. And I find I underline, I make notes in the margin, like my books are
the same thing.
You know?
I do the same. That's
Because once I start using my hand with a pen or a pencil, it's like in the highlighter, I do that, but it's not even as strong as if I like mark it up with a pen or a pencil. And I found that I get more out of books that way by integrating a physical activity, because I'm a strong kinesthetic learner.
Yes.
So in this book, Using Your Brain for a Change, one of the techniques of NLP is kind of like with Alexander work, when you get new information about how to use your body, it can affect your emotional state and how you think, and vice versa. Your emotional state can sort of be observable sometimes in the posture you choose or the way you move, right? Even what you're thinking has a body language element to it. And what really blew me away with some of the NLP work was it never occurred to me that whatever entered my head first was also a choice and changeable. So just like you're saying with movement, like how we get in and out of a chair, or even how we use our knife and fork, that we adopted it when we were little kids. And never, before Alexander work, I never paused to rethink, how am I doing this? And realize I had a choice about how to organize myself to do it. And that was what NLP was. If I'm a strong visual person, they point out that sometimes when we feel overwhelmed, it'll be a full movie screen picture in our head in brilliant color with surround sound, right?
Wow.
And visually, that's what we're seeing in our head that can make us feel overwhelmed by whatever that picture is showing us. And they go, you can play with that picture, right? So if it's a negative overwhelm, you could take that movie-sized theater in your head and you could shrink it down to, like, say, an old-timey photograph. Could make it black.
I like that. I was just having a lot of conversations with students when they come in, is they're always expressing where their pain is, where their problem is. And I wonder, if we sort of take that on and become that, instead of asking ourselves, like you said, I can change that thought. I have that pain, but I'm not that pain.
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
so changing that to, well, what's going good for you today?
So just in the visual element, because this is where sometimes as a teacher, I would use this as a tool to help people through a difficult part of learning or a difficult part with their horse. But if we just take sort of the visual element, which is our input system, one of our 5 senses, and if we're especially strong visually, like there's a list of things they made, I'm just going to read out, just related to, it's not what our eyes take in, it's the picture in our mind, right?
Exactly. It's the mental images.
Right. So it's just like when you edit a photograph, it's like you see all those tools for how to change the tone, the hue, the color, blah, 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 or on TikTok, all these different like filters you can try. You can change the look of something drastically, right? And that's actually what this book was saying. We can do that in our heads. especially if it's related to painful issues or issues that have us feeling stuck. So like just with visual, adjust the color, vary the intensity of color from intense bright to black and white. Distance, change it from very close to far away, and you'll have a different physical and emotional response by doing that. Right?
I love that.
Yeah. Change the depth. Vary the picture from a flat 2-dimensional photo to a full depth view of 3 dimensions. Change the duration. Vary it from quick, fleeting to a persistent image that stays for a time. Clarity. Change the picture from crystal clear or to fuzzy, right? Contrast. Adjust the difference between light and dark. Gradations of gray. Scope. Vary from a bounded picture within a frame to a panoramic picture that continues behind your head, right? So that goes
Oh,
through.
I like that one. Yeah, I often tell people, especially in our Zoom world today, that your eyes are just lenses of a camera, and you actually see with your optic nerve in the back of your head.
Right.
So just let the information come to you instead of going after it like that. You know?
Exactly.
Just let it come to you.
Like changing contrast, scope, movement, the speed of it. You could play it in slow-mo or fast forward, the hue, the transparency, the aspect ratio, the orientation. Where are you seeing it from? Right? Even if, are you seeing through your eyes or are you seeing yourself in the picture? Like,
oh, wow.
Those points of view. And all of that is just the visual element. But it's like we can take any of our 5 senses and play with it like we do on the computer. So if you think of a soundboard that a professional, record producer has, you think of all those variations to sound that you could make. So like the critic in our head, it could be our own voice, right? Or it could be the voice of somebody from our childhood or a friend or, authority, whatever. But we can play with that, right? Instead of feeling like it's weighing us down or we want to get away from that critical voice. Like the critical voice will have a certain tone and speed and what do I want to say? I don't know all the different words for sound, but anyways, it's like you could change that internal critic from this, deep, heavy, dark voice into like, what we sound like when we suck helium or Mickey Mouse, and it kind of makes it funny rather than so oppressive.
I like to, my image that I do when those tapes start playing, the negative tapes, I actually physically just go and pull it out and look at it like, really? Is that true? Is that really true?
That is a kinesthetic person's technique for sort of like getting over something that is, it feels like it shows up in our head and we have to deal with it. Whether it's the voice or it shows up as this picture and we just have to deal with what showed up in our head. Or we have this chronic back pain or knee pain that we think, I'm just getting old. I just have this problem.
Oh, all that language I hear. Yeah.
And it's like, it's so liberating to go, no, actually, we can play with it just like we would on iMovie or TikTok or an audio program. Like, no, we have lots of settings, right? We can play with those settings until we feel better or until, or until we feel more positive or until we can take a fresh start from a bad place, and it's not to subjugate or push away the bad feelings, but it's like when they start to take over your life, knowing you have a little bit of choice or some power to turn that around is really empowering that we don't have to just take that full-size movie of the thing we did wrong in school today and let that movie take over,
play and play and play and play and
yeah,
play.
take over the
Yeah.
whole office space or the
Yeah.
study space. It's like, no, we could just sort of shrink it down, put it in a box, get to it later.
I like that because I will sometimes, I feel better if I write it down because then it's not taking up any space. It's like, did I go down that corridor and get that done? But if I have a thought, another person I work with, it's collecting the thoughts and getting them out on paper if needed. And having it on paper, it's in front of you, but not taking up space in your brain.
Right. No, and I think the same too, like having a critical voice in your head, whether it's your voice or somebody else's voice. It's like, I guess writing it down could take it out of your head and put it somewhere else. But if it doesn't, if just writing it down doesn't, you can also alter the voice.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Yeah. Like you could turn it into a Muppet voice or a Disney character, and then it just doesn't sound so bad.
That's true.
Yeah.
I like that.
No, and I actually was teaching someone in teaching somebody the feel and the timing of how to use a whip appropriately to that horse while they were working at Liberty in a round pen. This person's energy was so sort of, really intense with this horse. And so I changed, and this is what we've talked about before, changing the language changes the voice, the auditory, and it can change the picture. So then it changes the kinesthetics. So most people are stronger. I think it's a minority of the population that are strong kinesthetic learners, but it's the majority of horse people.
This is true.
But most people are stronger auditorily or visually as learners. And so coming up with words to help people get the right kinesthetic communication with the horse is a process of finding words or metaphors that help people feel that. So for example, this woman in the round pen that was kind of overwhelming her horse with her energy, I said, it's not a whip, it's a magic wand. And you're gonna go, bippity boppity boo, could you trot? Right? Instead of,
I like that.
right? Right. So I could see, it was like if I put a voice or a picture into her nonverbal communication, me as the horse would have been like, back off, right? Right? Don't come near me with that energy. But in human terms, we express it with the tone of voice or the words we choose to use. But in a nonverbal communication, it's the timing, the feel, the frequency, the energy behind the action that is kind of the communication. So to change it from snap the whip to get your horse to trot into bippity boppity boo and trot, right?
I like that.
Yeah. And it lightens the situation too. It lightens the situation.
And there's one of my first teachers as an Alexander, and when I was in school, is to think of, for us as human, we think walking is a 2-step thing. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. But what if you just changed your thought and said, oh, no, it's much more like a waltz. It's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And that's a totally different way of thinking about walking.
Yes.
Then it's a linear 2-step thing. So.
Absolutely. And music is something I use a lot with writing. And I've worked with metronomes, and I've worked with people counting or singing, and I've worked lots of different ways auditorily to try to get the feeling of rhythm and motion on the horse. And it's music. I go, music is the only thing I see consistently, person to person to person, use their body in a more global, cohesive way when riding.
Oh, I like that, global. Yeah. Instead of instrumentation. It's a bigger picture.
Right.
When I was riding show jumpers, that's so funny because I used to sing Mary Had a Little Lamb in my head when I was riding around a course.
Yeah, I used row your boat for a long
Yeah, that one too.
Yeah.
So,
But finding music, it's like it gives the rider the consistency to then guide the horse into a rhythm. But when people would try to, like you and I are describing, when you sing it yourself, what happens is we don't realize the inconsistencies. We sort of go a little bit faster when the horse goes faster, and we speed up the song as we speed up our body. And then we go a little slower if the horse goes slower, and we slow down the song as we slow down our body. So having an outside consistent rhythm, the music, it helps us learn better control over our body, even when the horse is changing underneath us. So it's a very good tool to use. And when it was the metronome, if we say it or sing it, we don't realize how much we're adapting. If we use the metronome, I found people were trying to mentally do it by controlling their body, almost like what you call over efforting. Like they were trying to follow these little beeps with their body. And it was a little improvement, but I could tell the rider wasn't connecting into the feel of giving the aids or really bringing the horse into the rhythm.
I think that's that thing we have with anticipating or wanting to get it right. We're already, I work with riders, and it's the same thing with people. If I ask, okay, pick up a trot, you're already thinking trot and the horse is not.
Right. Right.
So there's that half halt or that pause that we need to inhibit trotting in our own little brain.
And that's what I find auditorily translates kinesthetically only with music. Because, and the music, I think everybody has different responses with music. The kinesthetics gravitate towards dance. The musicians or the auditories are the musicians and the singers. And the visual ones are the ones that came up with MTV. It's like they're the ones that figured out, that it's also a visual performance. That's part of music, is the visual part of it. So it's interesting somehow with music, it taps into maybe all three modes of it, where people can use their whole body to communicate rather than just stay in the head and think about aids independently.
I like that.
That's another interesting learning tool. Or even walking, like taking a walk with a dog or going for a walk. Or I'll walk through airports and pick different songs and go, what do I feel like if I walk at this tempo versus that tempo?
How many people do that?
I'm easily entertained. So it's like, yeah.
I'll have to try that.
But what's interesting to me and to you, because you're an Alexander technique instructor, is exploring all these amazing choices that we have in our movement and our body. And we have choice with our visual images, and we have choice with our auditory sounds in our own head. And it's like, to have that choice, for me, it made me more curious to go, and it can make you a little more intuitive, like starting to trust your intuition that this feels better. I feel safer, or I feel better, or it eases this pain issue, right? And that's just it's self-care, taking care of yourself, not becoming reliant on the expert fixing you, but being curious about how you perceive, right?
I like that. Yeah, that's where we spend a lot of time there.
Right.
And that curiosity of, could I do it differently? Could I do it this way? Could I not do it? That's my choice. I could not get out of the chair.
Yeah. Yes. And so we can explore physically, we can explore how to, like, even when I work with horses, there's sort of that mind balance, I call it, which is looking at the mental emotional state of the horse and the rider. And then there's the physical balance, looking at the mechanical use of the body, being efficient or dysfunctional. And even in those two categories, how we can explore and have choice to keep finding something towards balance. It's not getting away from bad feelings, but it's sort of balancing ourselves, right? Not too much of this, not too much of that, to enrich our lives.
I guess what I shared with a student last week was balance is not a static place.
Yeah.
Balance is constantly moving.
Constantly moving and adapting and growing
Yes.
and changing. And I think that also stimulates our brain function. It's a constant, light, comfortable challenge to our nervous system that keeps us from sort of hardening as we age, right?
I like that. Yeah.
In our neuroplasticity. I go, we don't have to just, get dementia because we're getting old. We can still be active learners inside our own skin, even as we age, right? And I think that keeps the brain function very active and always developing.
Yes. And that is actually one of the main questions that as an Alexander student, that we be creative and constantly be seeking something different.
Yeah. And it's like we've talked about before, sometimes different, especially when we feel like it happens to us. Our initial response is instability or insecurity. It's like something new usually pulls the fire alarm before we before we think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But to even get comfortable in the state of unfamiliar, that's where we can play with our five senses. We can play with our body, because the five senses are really input, but internally, if we're strong auditorily or visually or kinesthetically, we can change, we can play a little bit with the initial landing of how that arrived in our heads and start to find a way out of that, find a way out of overwhelm, feeling frustrated, going into fight or flight, which it's worse for us, right? The stress hormones. So the five senses are just an input system, but we also have what's called a reticular activation system, which is like a kind of a network of nerves in our brain that goes from the brain stem and sort of spreads out across our brain. And the reticular activation system, or the RAS, basically is a filter system, right? So even though our five senses can be receiving millions and millions and millions of bits of information, how we think and how we feel directs our reticular activation system to filter out what makes sense to us or what we're looking for. And so that's where playing or tweaking with what we think is just input through our five senses is not actually, because our RAS is already filtering out the actual information of sight that's coming through the lens of the eye, is already adapting in the brain.
Right.
The nerve. There's, it's not a direct, it's not always what you see is what you see.
I completely agree. Or what you feel is what is true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So always being curious and asking the question, is that really what I'm thinking, feeling?
Right. Or even like the studies on eyewitnesses, right? So an eyewitness to a criminal event, there'll be 10 eyewitnesses and they will have each a unique account of the exact same thing that happened, right? So there's an event a lady gets her purse snatched. 10 people see it. But then when they talk to the cop, each person saw something very, very different. How is that possible? They all witnessed the same event with the same exact facilities or the five senses, but how it was interpreted or filtered through the brain and then relayed was very different. Right? So the cop is looking for, was there one or two things that each of the 10 people noticed? And that's what sort of validates it, right? So it's an interesting phenomenon that we know about, that we don't all see things from the same perspective, or we don't all retain precise information that's coming through the eyes.
Yeah, that's that game, where somebody over here starts a sentence and you pass it along down the line of friends.
Oh,
By the
yes.
time you by the time you get to the sixth person, it's not the same sentence it was at the beginning.
So it's called the game of telephone, or some people, the Australian friends of mine called it Chinese whisper. And I think we called it telephone, that every time you talk to a new person, the conversation changes slightly and comes out the end completely different.
Yeah.
I think that happens internally in our head with our thoughts, our emotions, our perceptions of things. So to sort of play with it, and especially something that feels that is bordering, it's triggering defensive behavior or bordering on pushing us into the fight flight nervous system or the sympathetic nervous system, that's where we can actually stay healthier, not maybe release so many of what we call the stress hormones. If we can just change that, if we can play with all the different filters and buttons and controls and settings, whether it's strongest auditorily or visually or kinesthetically.
Yeah, I like to call it my tool belt.
Yeah.
I've got all these little different tools or ways of doing things that I can bring out and try. So that's what I try to tell my students is we're building you a healthy tool belt so that you have all these things you can go to other than what you are doing at the moment.
And the thing we have in common with our businesses, our relationship, is optimal posture and optimal balance, which can be construed as a place you get to and stay. But I go, nah, it's not really a place you can stay. And it's an experience more than anything else. And I go, we can say optimal on a physical level because a human body and an equine body, there's a blueprint of optimal use in the very construction of the body. Right? So it's kind of the form function principle that this shoulder joint is designed the way it is, not so much for weight bearing, but more for range of motion. Right? So the hip joint is a different construction. They're both ball and socket joints, but the construction of the ball and socket of the shoulder joint is very different than the ball and socket of the hip joint on the human, because it's the hip joint is much more weight bearing. So it's a ball and socket. We still get a huge range of motion, but the construction of it is different.
Right.
It's a deeper socket, right? The shoulder socket in the scapula is very shallow. Right? So that tells us we're not meant to walk on our arms. We're not meant, we can walk on our hands for short periods, right? Do a handstand and move around a little bit, but not for long, right? Because that's not the design of the arms, which tells us the function of the arms. But we can walk all day because that is the design and the function intended for the legs and the pelvis. So that's why we can say optimal, but each unique body sort of discovers the optimal use little by little. And what I found, firsthand experience that sent me down this path, working with a horse with just a rudimentary understanding of optimal function of the body, a really quote unquote difficult horse made an amazing turnaround in a very short amount of time. Just by sort of saying, hey, could we change your movement a tiny bit and move it this direction? The psychological effect that had on that horse was phenomenal. You know, instead of being a crazy, dangerous horse to ride, he had bucked his owner off, broke her back, and was given, you know, to a friend of mine. And then I worked with the horse and went, wow, that doesn't look like very balanced movement. Let me just play with the movement, both in groundwork and riding. And the horse in a couple of months, just a 180 in his personality, reliability, safety to ride, everything else changed by just moving the body gently towards its functional design, its function according to its design, which is
I like that. Yeah, and especially the gently part, because there's, I'm sure horses and humans, there's so many layers to unravel. And everybody goes at that at their own pace. If we do it gently and give the body permission to unveil itself.
Absolutely. And that for me, doing the Alexander technique lessons, one of the things that really struck me was I've looked and visually seen a lot of two-dimensional anatomy, but I'm a kinesthetic learner, right? So I could never translate that into my own body. It was weird. So when I started Alexander work, it became what I called an experiential anatomy lesson.
Oh, I like that.
Because, you know, they're like, point to your shoulder joint. And I pointed here. And I was like, I had this image in my head that the top of my arm stuck into my torso sideways, you know, kind of like I imagined the ball on the top of the femur stuck into my pelvis on the left and right side, right? And then I learned to feel it and go, oh, what do you mean my shoulder joint is in my back? Huh? And when I ask people, like students, when they're riding, I go, can you point to your shoulder joint? And it'll be here, like at the front of the arm. It'll be directly at the side of the arm. You know, it'll mostly be either right at the front of the torso or sticking in sideways from the left, directly left or directly right. That was my perception of it. And then just to experience sort of the rolling of the shoulder socket, like, oh, and then I had to go look at it again and went, oh, it's in the top of the scapula. I was like, why did I never see that before? I've looked at a lot of anatomy books, but it never registered because the picture in my mind and my personal experience was my arm stuck in sideways to my torso. It wasn't attached to my back. It was attached to my sides.
Yeah, and when we were working with kids in elementary school, just changing their perception, asking them, well, where does your head meet your neck? And most of them point, you know, in this vicinity of the lower neck.
Under the chin.
Yeah, and so they all had that slooping posture. And once we informed them that, no, it's up much higher, it's between your ears and behind your nose, it totally changed how they presented themselves in the classroom.
Absolutely. And that it's a mental picture, but
yes,
we realize how it affects our movement. So like, you know, the joint of the head to the neck being between the ears and behind the nose. I go, that's much higher. We think of our head balancing on our neck, starting under the jaw.
Right. And I see the same disconnect with the pelvis to the torso.
Oh yeah, because
that's a biggie with riders, especially.
Your legs start where your pants start.
That's we all have that perception, and to rethink that, to plant a new seed of actually, no, your pelvis is connected to your back. It's like, wow, that's huge.
Yeah, or that the hip joint is where your pants crease in the front. It's not.
All these little cool giveaways we're sharing today.
Yes. Yeah, because it's like my hip joint's in the front, not stuck to the side, and my
Mhm.
shoulder joint is on my back, not stuck to the side. And it does change how you can explore your body, how you can even relieve some of your own pain symptoms.
I
Because
agree.
just like idiopathic lameness in a horse, it's the small repetitive misconceptions, misuse, small repetitive damage that makes us think we're just aging or the horse is just getting old, right? But it's just a buildup of small misconceptions or misuses over time.
Same with people.
Yeah. All right, my dear, I think, is there anything you want to add?
Oh, that was great.
Okay, so next week or next podcast next week, I have a paper on how the horses perceive through their five senses.
Ooh, fun.
Because human to human, we all have the same experience. We know how we perceive through our five senses, but there's this great paper by Saslow, Saslow. Anyways, we're going to both read the paper and talk about it next podcast, because to look at how a non-human might have a completely different input system through their five senses than we do is part of developing communication and understanding and compassion for working with animals. Each one is different. So thank you guys for joining us. And I hope you pay attention to the words that come out of your mouth naturally will describe your strongest perception. So notice if they're related to hearing, seeing, or feeling. And that will kind of clue you in whether you're a strong auditory learner, visual learner, or kinesthetic learner, and you can play with that to your advantage. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Be kind.